Be careful getting in there.
Thank you, Koya, and thanks for everybody being here and having me be here. Um, I'm gonna. I was really excited about this topic because it is something that I have struggled with throughout my career. Trying to. Wait a minute. I'm trying to set my timer here so I don't go over time. um, So anyway, yeah, I mean, I've spent my entire career trying to juggle this notion between form and impact or content, whatever. And let me just start by saying, I knew about uh, the issue of impact way before I knew anything about art. I didn't know anything about art for a long time, and and so I want to start. I want to do this talk basically by looking at kind of three different ways that I've engaged with impact and form. And the first one is basically me kind of trying to figure out how to use art as a way of direct impact from a more reflective or in a representational way. And then the second one is more about community engagement. And then going to the final one, it's more about reflective, but it's much more internal. So I'm going to go through those really quickly. I'm going to show lots of images, and so we can have a conversation here. But I want to start, though, the very beginning. This image is an image that is from rural Alabama. That's where I grew up. I grew up in a farming environment, and from a very, very early age, as a child, I grew up in these cotton fields, and I always had an understanding about something about dignity of life, dignity of work, and I wouldn't say it wasn't about social justice, but it was just I was always trying to figure out, how do you honor people that grow up or live in situations that are less fortunate than others. So I always had this idea that I wanted to do something. I always knew that there was a certain kind of impact I wanted to have. Can I get some water? Yeah. And but I didn't know what form that would take until I went to college and I started this whole process of bumping into these accidents. Well, maybe they're not accidents; they're more incidents, and that's why I titled the talk "The Accidental Artist," because the truth of the matter is, from where I came from in these cotton fields, there's no reason I should be here and talking about art because it wasn't relevant. It wasn't a part of my life. But the first accident was going to college, the first one of 12 siblings to go to college. I went to college to play basketball. And accidentally I ended up in an art class. I didn't know anything about it, but I said, okay, well, this is what they told me to take. I'll just take it. And then I found that I liked it. I mean, I've realized too that I could do a little bit of drawing, but I was way behind all the other students because they were, people grew up doing it. And so, but the one thing that I found about it that was interesting for me was that it was taught to me as a way in which we could speak about the humanity that we live in. And I was interested in that because that dealt with the issue of impact. And so then I eventually kind of moved myself into this notion of form. And as a painter, I was trained as a traditional landscape painter at a small college, but eventually I moved into more figurative work that could address the issues that I was most concerned with. So I'm going to go through quickly a couple of images from that. This is one of the earlier images of work from the 80s when, I was trying to deal with the issues of the time, right? I was a young 20-something-year-old living in Mississippi and finding out 3 years after the fact that 60 miles from where I was living in Mississippi, there was a young man my age who was lynched by the terrorist Ku Klux Klan group, and just 60 miles away from me. And I didn't know about it until 3 years later, and I read about it in the New York Times. So I had this opportunity to do an art project, and I kind of pulled these images together and created this installation as at an art space in Houston. And and then I went on and I continued to explore, this form of making these works that kind of talked about specific issues that was relevant to the communities I was living in. And this one dealt with the issue of police brutality. But what was interesting about this, and the reason I show this image, is because it was also the first time that I found that the work was to project and solicit a certain kind of impact, but it took a little bit more than that. There was a kind of organizing around it. So I did this piece about police brutality, and I organized this was a press conference that I organized with all of my activist mentors to do with inside the installation. And then, so that was my first kind of incidental activity as an artist. But then the next thing came when a young person kind of challenged me about this notion of the impact that this kind of work have on the community that he exists in, because he said, we live with this stuff all the time. We know what it's about. And he said this very peculiar thing. He said, if you're an artist and artists are creative, why can't you create a solution? And that kind of turned my life upside down and made me kind of rethink. So I shut down my studio for a couple of years to just kind of contemplate and think about this. And so as I was thinking about it, I went back to some of the things that were familiar with me that ended up starting this project that's called Project Row Houses, my first community engaged project. And the project came about, I show these images because these were two key factors in kind of me finding my way within the context of community engaged work. The one on the right is a book that someone had given me some years ago that I thought I had tossed out, but somehow I didn't. And I was going through some stuff and I saw it laying around and I started reading it. And it was talking about this notion of social sculpture. And I found that to be really interesting, this notion that, that we could think of the world as a piece of sculpture and we're all sculpting it, and everybody has to be an artist in the process and all this stuff. And that was really interesting for me as something that could have a different kind of impact and through a different form of practice. But then to be able to figure out what that form would be and how it would manifest itself, I kind of meandered into an accidental tour of a neighborhood in Houston where they were talking about dangerous places in this neighborhood and they wanted the city to rectify it. And they stopped at this little spot of what we call little shotgun houses. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this stuff because it's take too long. But anyway, they said it was the worst place in the neighborhood. But then I saw it and I started reflecting on this person's work. His name is John Biggers. He was more of a regional artist in the Texas area, but he did a lot of paintings really trying to show the life of Black people, Southern Black people, in a dignified way. And I saw those, and after I saw these little houses on this tour, and it just kind of, the ones at the bottom reminded me of this painting. And so I kind of formulated this idea to say, well, look, if Joseph Beuys thinks that the world can be, a work of art, sculpture, then certainly a community could be in these little 22 houses. I said, maybe we can do this. And so that was my that's my intro into this idea of community engaged work, knowing that the impact is strongest when there's participation and collaboration. And so the role of me as the artist was just kind of to create the platform and try to engage and connect people in ways that they could employ their own creativity. So this was the beginning of the project. And just to give a little bit of sense of how people participated in this project, it's like we had, and I hear people talk about this all the time about funding for doing community projects. And I always tell them that I never think about funding for community projects. I think about resources. What are the resources? And if we think about the creative resources that we have is unlimited. So why not rely on that? And so this process of redeveloping these 22 houses initially came about through the creativity of different people from different walks of life. We didn't have any money, so this one museum director from a museum in Houston called the Menil Collection, the director came up with an idea. He said, you know, if you're doing these houses, we were doing them one at a time. He said, well, look, I could give my employees off on Mondays, and we have great skilled people and people that can help do this renovation. We'll renovate one for you. But he didn't stop there. He came back and he said, we'll challenge the big museum to do it. And once he challenged the big museum, the other arts institutions came in, and then local churches came in, and then sorority groups, and so on. And so it just became this huge collaboration of people from all walks of life trying to bring their creativity into the process. And so we developed this project around this notion that artists could be the seed for generating that kind of creative engagement. So some of the houses were used for artists to kind of contemplate and work out projects and ideas, or even just show work. It also engaged youth in terms of getting young people, connecting them with artists and other people who had links to a world broader than what they were accustomed to, and in an educational sense. And then included in that was one of the far-reaching things that we were able to do with this project, was to take 7 of the houses and do something that would be symbolic of how you care for families that are at a disadvantage or have less opportunities than others. And we started something called a transitional housing program for single mothers. And so this is just an example. But the point of doing a housing project in an art project was really, it's not so much, we only did 6 houses for young mothers. But the point was to be symbolic, to be symbolic of what kind of life should we be providing for people. So we would rework the houses with interior designers, working with the young mothers that are going to live there, and so on and so forth. So once we did these 22 houses, then we had the opportunity to be reflective. I mean, it was already kind of working both within the community and outside of the community. I mean, trying to bring those resources together for the purpose of empowerment within that local community. And then it kind of moved on to some broader kind of real estate development in terms of trying to symbolically show the city how a under-resourced community could evolve and empower the community of people that live there. And so we continue to do this. These are just examples of the process of how you get it done. It was really about organizing people, giving people a sense of power, that it's not the artist doing it, it's not the city doing it, this is something that you have to do for yourself, but we give you a framework in which you can kind of work through it. So these are just examples of different kind of architectural efforts that were made in the housing sector, but there's also some commercial stuff as well. And this is an overall view of it within the context of the city of Houston. Now, I'm going to move on to a couple of other community engaged projects just to kind of show, because Project Row Houses started in 1993 and it continues today. But that's kind of my own neighborhood, so it kind of makes sense. But it's a practice, right? It's a practice of form. So as an artist practicing, it's important to practice that in many different ways, in as many different ways as possible. So I have a number of different projects I've worked on, but this is just one. I'm going to show just 2 that are in different contexts outside of Houston. This one is in Dallas. It was a neighborhood that was presented to me as one of the most troubled neighborhoods in the city of Dallas. And it was a neighborhood that had gotten caught in the transformation of time. That's my first half. So that's just my first half. I have to do it in halves here. So in time, it shifted. This was in the 70s. It was one of the best neighborhoods, but then all of a sudden it began to be called one of the worst neighborhoods. And when I visited, these are just images that I would just take, just kind of the conditions as it was when I moved in. And it was much more, I was really kind of startled by how, and why this neighborhood was such a problematic place for the city. And as I walked through and I started to notice the incredible diversity of people in the neighborhood, and what I found out was that because there were so many apartments in this, concentrated apartments in this neighborhood, that it was, as people started to move out, it became a great place to place refugees or immigrants. And so groups like Catholic Charities, the International Refugee Committee would just flood immigrants and refugees in this neighborhood. And of course, they're under-resourced. And so there's lots of violence and stuff happening. But so my approach to that was, after talking to people and hearing people say that, well, maybe the problem is not so much that there are all these people that are quote unquote different from us, but it's just that they don't have any way of coming together. And so I pulled together a group of people in Dallas to work with me, and we just went through the neighborhood, doing group meetings on the streets everywhere, talking and trying to figure out what's the form, what form can we give this community to kind of deal with some of the challenging issues that they have. And one of the things that came up a lot was that many of the people who had moved to this neighborhood, they were accustomed to markets, where they would gather in markets to trade and buy and do stuff. And so we came up with this idea of thinking of, like, what if we created markets in this neighborhood? Would that be a platform for people to kind of engage and empower them in their circumstance? And I was doing this through a museum in Dallas, the National Sculpture Center. And they were skeptical of this idea, and there were people in the community that were skeptical because they thought of the violence and all. But we started out and we said, well, let's just do it. And we'll do the first one, we'll call it the Lucky Pot, and we'll do it around food and see, how many we can get people to come together around food. And we did the first one, and it was turned out to be amazing. Like, people, we were thinking if we could get 3 or 4 groups to bring food and kind of have this food thing, but it turned out like 17 different ethnic foods were presented there. People were in conversation with each other about their foods. And so then there was a young kid in our group that came along and said, oh, we should do a talent show, which I didn't think was a great idea. But we ended up doing it, and it turned out to be it was even better. We had so many performers, people from like a 3-year-old little girl, Somalian girl, doing traditional dance, to a 86-year-old white man doing the hokey pokey, and so everybody was bringing their talents to the table, and it just became this kind of thing, and then we kind of pushed it because there were lots of immigrants and refugees that were actually, who had a higher level of practice of art, and we wanted to find ways to do that, and we challenged the architecture community in Dallas. After I had made a trip to London, I went to a friend of mine, an exhibition there, and he had an exhibition at White Cube Gallery, and it was impressive, So I went back and I said, we need white cube galleries in this neighborhood. So I challenged the architects to design me some white cubes so we could do these exhibitions. And so we had, on the streets of the neighborhood, we built these little cubes. There were like 6 of them, and they were used in multiple ways. I mean, they were used as exhibition spaces. They were used for people to get in up from the rain, if they were waiting on a bus, something, So it just became this kind of place to use and function. So that project kind of set the stage for the next project, which was in Athens as a part of Documenta. And, when I went there in 2016 for the first time, actually 2015 I went the first time, 2016 I went for Documenta. But it was right around the time of the crisis, the border crisis, the financial crisis, and all this in Athens, and so I wanted to explore that and partner with some artists there, chiefly Maria Papadimitriou, to kind of look at establishing a platform, a forum through which people can actually kind of work through this tension that had grown between the Greek natives, the immigrants who had been there for some of them generations, and the refugees. And we had this idea that really what was necessary was a place for cultural dialogue. I mean, we just wanted to move beyond the political because we knew that was contentious for a lot of people. But let's just look at the cultural conversation here and see where this would lead us. And so we started this project, in a little storefront space, starting with the aesthetics and design of it from immigrant women from a local nonprofit organization that worked with refugee women, and artists who were willing to loan their material, their silkscreen material, and so on and so forth, and do workshops with them to kind of shaping this space. And then starting to engage it and in programming it with different kinds of ways, trying to make sure that that this place was constantly programmed with thinking about intergenerationally, culturally, racially, and just trying to figure out how do we get people to kind of move beyond this idea of the confrontation that the political circumstances put them in, because thinking that maybe if they could meet somewhere culturally, politically, they may be able to find some way to kind of work together. But so the project, it kind of started in this little building space, but it was critical in terms of, and speaking of form, one of my things that I'm not an architect or a designer, I have no experience in that, but I do have this experience around use and how people come together. And so this particular project started at Victoria Square, which was kind of ground zero for the refugee community. And that square was an incredibly dynamic square. And when I was looking at doing the project, many people were saying that it had to be in the square, but my sensibility of it was that it needed to be off the square because it needed to be a place where people can, absorb things and be reflective of it and not just be a part of the whirlwind of it. And so we took this space that's on more of a pedestrian street that kind of went through this little neighborhood and spilled out into the broader community on the other end, which allowed us to use the street. And the street became the most dynamic part of this project because it became the auditorium for talks and lectures, readings, performances, fashion shows, and or even just like I think this is mostly on the bottom is from a Greek chorus, and on the top right is Africa Night, and so it's just many different kinds of things. And the one thing that was talking about it from a symbolic standpoint is that it allowed this opportunity for people to question how they were thinking about dealing with the refugees and the immigrants in that context, which brought lots of attention. The two photographs at the bottom were the mayor of Athens, who came often to visit and to be there and to try to learn and participate and show his support for kind of a more diverse way of thinking for Greeks to embrace, and all the way to the one at the top, that's Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who also made his way as he was running for prime minister, and but trying to really grapple with this idea. So it became a platform for people to do that. And then the last accident goes back to the one that is much more, it's more reflective, but as I said, internally as opposed to externally. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that, a lot of my community engaged work being external, it depletes sometimes the internal. And so without even knowing that, I accidentally found my way back into a studio practice by basically doing something that led my community engagement, which is the game of dominoes. I mean, I played dominoes in every community that I go to because it's a way of just kind of getting people in a relaxed environment to participate and have conversation. And but then I got challenged by someone to be in an exhibition, and I declared that I didn't make objects for exhibitions, and I just wouldn't do it, and they kept pressuring. So as a joke, I transformed something that I was always fascinated with, which was the way the dominoes would lay on the table and how they looked, the patterns and stuff, and I would photograph them all the time. But so to kind of play off of this guy of making something for an exhibition, I said, okay, so instead of photographing them, I just traced all the games that we played, and that was the scorecard, the game, and then all of a sudden it started to make patterns. And then, of course, as an artist who worked with form, I hadn't worked in kind of a two-dimensional form in so long, but then all of a sudden, I got interested in it, and so I just kept pushing it and seeing where it would go, and these are more drawings of it, and then it became more paintings, and and they just kind of move and shift the markings of the paintings, and so on and so forth. And now, I find myself in this place where, kind of moving through the form of painting as a more didactic form to, social sculpture, which is much more about community engagement, and now trying to figure out how to bridge those two things. I mean, there are elements of the studio paintings now that really reinvigorates the notion of doing community engaged work, but it's also an opportunity to kind of also speak in a different way about, impact, and to a different group of people about impact. And so while I feel like I'm still early in my stage of exploring this, but I'm very excited to see where it goes. Thank you. That was fast. I hope I didn't.
That's great. Thank you, Rick. I think we're mic'd up, so we don't need to touch this microphone, right? So if you need any changes. Rick, while you get yourself settled in, let me just take a moment to say thank you for giving us such a beautiful synopsis of the practice and of the journey that forms the core, the backbone of the practice. It's no secret that your work has been extremely influential. One is always running into people who are artists or who are practitioners of civic practices, urban practices, creative practices at that hinge, who are always referring back to the model that you set. And so thank you for your generosity in doing all that work all this time and then in sharing it with us. I have a number of different angles that I'd like to bring up, and so I've just taken a note on my phone here. And more or less, to go back a little bit to the beginning, you have said many times, and you showed us again just now, how this kind of alchemy of thinking about Beuys and Biggers played a fundamental role in kind of crystallizing the idea of row houses, with the third element being everything that you had done as kind of an artist, activist, experimenting in Houston and elsewhere before to get there. And one piece that is interesting to me about that is that Beuys and Biggers is an intersection of the canon and the quote unquote obscure largely because regional, as you said. And the regional artist is a category that I think about a lot in working in the United States, for example. What to me feels constantly revitalizing about artistic and civic practice in the United States is not so much what happens in New York and Los Angeles and finds its way into the big galleries and the museums and the press, although of course that's an important role, but it's actually the practices that are happening in what we call the regions. And I think that you can have an analogous view across the sort of the Western industrial world. And so I wonder if we could just chat for a little bit about the regional practice as a bank of knowledge. Looking back, the kinds of ideas, the kinds of thinking that come from Biggers and others that we could call regional artists and practitioners that you encountered in Houston and in the South in general. How fundamentally shaping was that to thinking about how to do a practical intervention?
Hmm. Oh, it was incredible because being from Houston, people don't think of Houston in the international context. It's mostly it could vary. Almost anything you do in Houston could easily slip into a regional mode. And so I empathize with John Biggers. In fact, doing Project Row Houses, it wasn't this, it wasn't an idea thinking like, oh, we're going to do this internationally recognized thing. It was like, let's and this is the thing I learned from Biggers too. It's like, let's do the honest practice from where we are, and then allow that to go where it needs to be. And so with someone like John Biggers, whose work expand a great amount of perspectives, but it was the sincerity that he took to the work that allowed him to find comfort in it being, categorized however people wish, and allowing it to have its impact from there.
It occurs to me that the regional artist is a category that includes people who may have fundamentally a studio practice, or who may be professors, teachers at a more or less prestigious or public university or school. They can also be people who don't have a formal category, a formal designation. They can be informal culture keepers. They can be people who are really sort of in community. And so they break across the organizational and professional silos that we have in the art industry.
Right.
But what they all have in common is this textured relationships with people there, on the ground.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things, though, about now with social media and all that stuff, there are opportunities to kind of, push and have agency beyond the regional, perspective, which has been kind of interesting to see how that happens, and to see what that does to the, that kind of authentic sincerity of the work, though, and when does it become, what did it say in the activist world? It said act local and
yeah,
there's a saying, act
think
local.
globally, think globally, act
Yeah,
locally.
act local.
Yeah.
Yeah, and is that being kind of reversed, right? Whereas like, you're thinking globally,
Yeah.
First and foremost, trying to figure out how do you get out of the region, and then that eats away at the ability to act locally.
Yeah, and then of course the management consultants and the professional thought leaders came up with global, and the ugliness of that shows us how poised these kinds of ideas are between great beauty and
Yeah.
and great ugliness.
Yeah.
The photographs that you showed us from row houses, and then also from Dallas, and then also from Athens, they show these very enchanted moments. And I think that all of us probably have had opportunities to be in spaces where, you know what, this feels right. Yes, there are rich people, poor people, yes, this, yes, that, institution, bank, grassroots, whatever. But wow, at this very moment right now, what a wonderful mix of people are here, and what a great joy is being shared and experienced in this moment. Brought together by artists in some way. It's an enchanted moment. But the enchanted moment sometimes lasts a long time, or renews and iterates, and sometimes it really breaks quickly. Sometimes just before the enchanted moment was a lot of real complexity to even get to that point.
Absolutely.
And people left along the way, and resentments and conflicts and so on. And sometimes after the enchanted moment comes some source of funding was taken away, or some people in an organization got in a fight with each other, or whatever. Any number of things can happen. And so the enchanted moment is something that those of us with the privilege to move around can be like, oh man, I was at Koyo's organization in Dakar, and we were having lunch in the back, and then I was at this thing, and wow. But it's a very fragile thing. And so I guess I would ask you, what have you learned about making that enchanted moment something that can iterate and can have a life? Or how much should we even hope for that to happen? How much should we instead focus on that moment? Just to add one more piece into it, there was a word that you used a couple of times in your presentation that was very interesting, which was symbolic, right? You said that what you tried to do at row houses was to do a symbolic demonstration of how certain problems could be addressed. And symbolic is interesting because symbolic sometimes means a representation that holds a lot and that carries a lot that we can read into. And then there's the other meaning of symbolic, which is, oh, well, for symbolic sum, or symbolic, there's kind of almost a pejorative to it. And so, but at the same time, if you have housing for 6 single mothers, that's real, right? And so when we look at how the framing of this conversation has been established so well by Philip Ursprung, between form and impact, symbol is actually a very interesting piece of a triangle, right? I think a triangle, some kind of a Dreieck was being discussed by the mayor early. Symbol is an important piece. So that symbol is also where the enchantment lives. Yeah. So I wonder if you could kind of react to those thoughts.
There's a lot there. When you talk about the images that I show, first of all, I just want to just think about this because I was just reading something about Claire Bishop. She's doing a talk somewhere, whatever, and I just go back to her and I think about her and her problem with the idea of social practice or community engaged work. She says, you see it all. You just, you go and you just see people that show pictures. So I mean, I just showed a bunch of pictures. It's like what's behind those pictures, and that's kind of what you're hitting on. It's like the pictures are important because they do kind of hold and embody those moments that can be symbolic. And to me, that's kind of that's one of the great values of art, that it allows us to see things in ways that inspire us. It becomes a symbol of something that's inspiring. But as you said, though, but there's a lot of stuff that happens before those images and after those. I mean, those moments and after those moments, and and some of them are like so magical and beautiful and whatever, and some of it just messy and it's like just like life. I mean, life is that way. When you approach things and you're trying to move things, there are going to be things that doesn't quite, it's not pretty, it's not seamless, it's this tension, this struggle. And but that's part of the that's part of the work. And that's, I think, we in society, we like things to be easy and simple and clean and stuff, but really we grow in that kind of murkiness of tension, and so I embrace all of that, In fact, that's what I was kind of telling you this earlier, that one of the things that I find in the practice of the kind of work that I've been doing that's lacking is kind of real critical, conversations about it. And most people, they're a little hesitant to do it because oftentimes the work is coming from a genuine sense to have a good impact, and you don't want to tear people apart for that. But there's something about the form and the practice, though, that is important, and so I'm always looking and listening for people to say, to hear, like if there's a criticism, let me know, because that's the way you grow the practice.
A couple of questions about crisis. I'll try to make these ones short because I know that time is already limited, but form, impact suggests a problem to solve, which moves back to crisis. And indeed, we're talking about a housing crisis. We're talking about racial and class crises. We're talking about different kinds of crises. Your interventions that you have shown us here have taken place over a period of 2 or 3 decades in as different crises have unfolded. There's also a sense now of accelerating crisis, or of a really large extra state of crisis that we're in right now, that includes all of those other crises and somehow has multiplied and concatenated in ways. And right now, it would be remiss not to point out that a strong driver of that acceleration is in the country that you and I are citizens of, that we are still citizens of until they change our status. But of course, the permission structure for these crises, it floats around, and it's a crisis that's here and in other parts of the world as well. I say that to say, is there a point at which the crises become so intense at their macro level or in the local manifestation that these modes of operation, it's not even that they can't work, it's that they're too much to even figure out how to get into?
Well, I'll tell you what, that's one of the that's one of the blessings, I think, of going back to painting, after years of doing the community engaged work, is to be reminded of this thing as an artist who makes objects. The real interesting thing about it is that you just do it out of habit, out of practice. You just do it. It doesn't matter if yesterday was not a good day in the studio, or it didn't happen, whatever. Tomorrow you just go and you start making stuff, And I think that, being in the studio and being able to do that on a daily and weekly basis, to see that it helps me understand that, whether we all get kicked out of the country or not, we still have to continue to do the work. You just continue to do the work as a part of the practice of life.
Can these interventions take place in the territories of the rich and privileged, or do they always need to take place in the terrain of the crisis, as seen as where the bad stuff is happening? How do we do the same intervention, or how do we work in the same spirit, but we do it in the posh neighborhoods?
Well, that's an interesting question, because, as I always thought about my practice of doing community engaged work, particularly Project Row Houses, and trying to build a network of collaborators, artists that are participating, that's not exclusive of anyone. In fact, being able to have funders who we can engage in the process as they're working on the project, and everybody, it doesn't matter where you come from, there's a role, that we all play. In fact, also the painting part becomes kind of interesting for me too, because it also allows me to bring that conversation into a different space, into a different context of people. Now, and obviously people use it and manifest their connection to it in different ways. I mean, there are people on a community level, it means something very different to them, and they manifest their connection to it one way, but people from outside that see it in a painting, but it's living with them now in some way.
The cynic, or perhaps a fellow exhausted person, might say, to what extent is the return to the studio a result of some kind of burnout or some kind of exhaustion?
Yeah, I think I think it is that, but because it is a response to the burnout, it is also a rejuvenating element to it. So,
Philip, do we have time for one from the audience, or two? Can we solicit? There's so much collective genius. Maybe if they do a quick one, we can have two. Maybe we can just ask for two directly, and then Rick can do. Yeah.
And the answer will be yes, no.
So we're gonna take two. We're gonna take that one there, and then I want a different energy for a second one. Who's got another one? Who's got another one? Speak now. Otherwise, we're only going to take one.
Why not?
Oh man,
Thank you.
The famous guy. Okay, no, we'll take those two. Yeah. So in the back, and then
Perfect.
Hans, we can come back to you.
Thank you for this interesting discussion and dialogue. I want to quote earlier Philip mentioned about the interest of politicians in art, and we know the outcome. And Siddhartha, you mentioned now what is happening geopolitically and at the macro level. And I think today there is, of course, a fact. And I think there was two important signals that I would love to get your thought, Rick, how as an artist, despite the challenges we are facing today, I think we got very important green light from the newly elected President of the United States about the freedom of speech, regardless how we think about it, but giving back, say whatever you want. And a couple of weeks back, the CEO of Meta said, no more filters, anyone can use the word or expression you would like to do. Okay. So if you take this into consideration as a reality today, what would you be doing differently to take this and really express in a very strong way as an artist to create this movement and raise the awareness of what is working and what is not working? Thank you.
Okay, great. So, and the other question, we'll take both together and then Rick can answer.
Okay, hello, Matthias von Harz, Zürcher Theaterspektakel. You have described amazing community aware projects, and I think we all know several of them. I've been involved in many of them, and throughout the last 10 years, I've asked myself, how can we make this grow? I mean, there's always individual amazing projects, but in the whole cultural sector, both funding, structures, infrastructures, institutions, there's little support for that to make sure this grows and more of that happens in these times of crisis that we are facing. Do you have any idea of what we can do together to make this blossom?
Yeah, I don't have a, I don't have a toolbox, I mean, but I do think that it's just really, it really is just people kind of, taking the moment and thinking of themselves as creative beings. And they could be artists, but they don't have to be artists. I mean, if I went through the lists of all the things that happened through particularly Project Row Houses over time, so many of the incredible creative ideas that happened in that project didn't come from artists. It came from people who worked in corporations or people that lived in a neighborhood, that just came with their, the platform allowed them to be creative. And I think we just have to believe in that, and we have to keep pushing it. And actually now I think we kind of almost have to start demanding it too. We can't let people just get away with sitting on the sidelines. We all have to be active participants.
And that this may rejoin what the first question was, which is there something liberating or perhaps paradoxically liberating in the current political shifts?
Yeah, and the notion of freedom of expression, and yes, I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out, because, we all know who does not want freedom of expression, and it's not the people who are saying now that they do want it. So we'll see how it plays out. So.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for your work, and thank you, Philip and company, for having us.